So my name is Brian Runciman. Yesterday we had a great start to our event. We had Dame Steve Shirley talking to us about her experience, which is, well, it was tremendous. Our own Adam Thilthorpe talked about professionalism. Today we're going to have a look at another aspect of IT professionalism. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a speech from Matt Haworth, who's a change agent. Matt's with us there, and Rebecca George, who I'll bring on a little bit later on. We're going to start with Matt. Let me just share my slides with you so you can see exactly what we're doing. This is our session 2, the value of personal responsibility. It's a similar theme to yesterday, slightly different angles. We'll come on to Rebecca shortly. We'll give her time to just get her breath. But first of all, we're going to have a talk to Matt Haworth. Matt is a social change agent. I think that's the best way to put it. So Matt, I'm going to give the screen to you and hand over to you to talk to the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Really great to be here, and thanks very much for the invite. So Brian described me as a change agent, which I've never been described as an agent before. So that's that's a new one. So I thought I'd just expand on what we mean by that. I'm really blessed to have a career that involves working with lots of different people themselves working towards trying to make change. What that entails is supporting change makers in charities, philanthropists, and sometimes people running small community groups to find ways to use digital and technology to effectively help them do more of the good stuff that they're already doing. So quite a lot of my role is about facilitating good things that are12 happening by other people. As part of that, I wrote a book about digital fundraising a couple of years ago. And 12 years ago now, in this very back bedroom where I am now interned, I founded a social enterprise called Reason Digital. So through that social enterprise, we've worked with all sorts of organizations to help them either raise more money and find more volunteers, or perhaps to deliver services in new and interesting ways digitally. I'm also on the board of a couple of charitable organizations as well. So I wanted to talk to you if you are here because you're interested in maybe doing a bit of good. Maybe it's something that's always been a thing for you, and maybe it's something that's been inspired by recent global events, be that the protests that we've seen around the Black Lives Matter movement, or the COVID crisis that's hitting the world. Whatever the reason is, it doesn't really matter. Welcome, and I'm glad you're here. I think it's quite interesting actually working within digital with IT, because I think a lot of IT professionals have this sense in common. What draws them into the industry is this idea that things can change, things can be made differently, things can be improved, things can be recoded, and those kind of beliefs I think work really well towards ethics and change making, which is why I think we see so much interesting debate and interesting contributions by IT professionals towards ethics and towards social good. But society has a different view maybe of what constitutes change makers, and I think there's maybe these kind of 3 key ways that society gives us a view that that we can make change. Broadly speaking, you've got the sort of social inventor like Jenner here, inventing a vaccine. You've got the philanthropist like Gates, and you've got the sort of movement leader like Thunberg here. So I think it's great to see these high-profile, inspirational people, but sometimes I think it gives us a slightly limited view about what it is to be a change maker and how we can make change. So what other ways are there? Well, actually, one thing I want to impress upon you is that you don't need to be one of those archetypes in order to make change. You might think, oh, well, you know, of those 3 archetypes, I guess I'm closest to the inventor. So maybe I need to come up with some amazing technical innovation that's going to change the world, some big new app, some amazing algorithm that's going to help people. And if you can do that, fantastic. I don't want to turn you off that at all. But it might be that that's not what you're about or not where your skills are. And if that's the case, that doesn't really matter, because social impact isn't necessarily about inventing new technologies that have social impact. A lot of the time, it's about using technologies that are already out there and finding new uses for them, or even helping somebody that's doing something really good and really positive in their community with a bit of technology that's been around for years that they just don't know how to use. So, for example, the Shaw Trust, an amazing organization that does a lot in accessibility, they switched to Salesforce recently. They saw an increase of 31% in the number of volunteers signing up. You know, imagine the knock-on effect for that organization. And maybe that's within your skill set, Salesforce. Maybe you could help them do something like that. So it doesn't always have to be big new inventions. I think my favorite example of this is when the Blue Cross was struggling with falling donations. The Blue Cross is an animal charity because people weren't carrying change in their pockets anymore. So not as many people were putting 50p in the head of the fiberglass Labrador outside of the shop. And they decided they needed to reinvent that. And what they came up with, because they didn't have the technology at that time to invent a whizzy new donation box that took contactless, they basically just sellotaped a contactless card reader to a Labrador. And I don't know about you, but I want to pet that Labrador so much that if you said you can only pet it with your MasterCard, I would still be up for that. But that is an example of how a bit of old technology there put to a new use can have a big social impact. And charities really need your skills right now. Actually, change makers really need your skills, because it's kind of, the charity sector isn't as advanced as you might believe. 40% of charities don't have the digital skills to take donations online, which is a huge disadvantage to them right now during the COVID crisis. 13% of charities in the UK showed no digital activity in 2019. That's 26,000 organisations. And 2 in 3 of the high income charities actually had a recorded cyber breach or attack in 2018. So if you're a cybersecurity professional, then we definitely need your help as well. Because of the COVID crisis, it's estimated there'll be a 12.4 billion shortfall in charity income this year, which means it's so important for charities to find new ways to either take money offline in donations or find new ways to deliver services that are more cost effective or able to be delivered in a lockdown scenario. At Reason Digital, we do some research every year about how the great British public interacts with charities and good causes online. And we found that for 2 years running, only 5% of the public used a charity service online. And this was pre-coronavirus. We did this in November 2019, so just before it hit. So a lot of these charities do need help bringing these services online, and have a think about if that's a way that you could make change in helping them to do that, either by actually doing the tech, or it might just be about being an advisor, being an honest broker, joining their board, joining an advisory board to help them benefit from your advice and expertise. That is really precious to them. Another way that we can be a change agent is by not doing bad. So we can do actively good stuff, but a lot of us might think, when we think about social good and being a change agent, we might think about charity work and volunteering, but we might not think about, is there a way that we can be against bad things happening around us? And often that can be very powerful as well. So it's not all about doing good. It's also about doing no harm as well. Ideally, do both, but it could be that you're a change agent just by focusing on one of these things. I don't know about you, but I was absolutely jubilant to see the statue of Colston taken down in Bristol recently. It felt like watching a real turning point in history and a real start of some change. But, you know, how many of us think how much of those kind of attitudes and ideas from the time of Colston actually exist within the fabric of our work? And you might think, Matt, that's ridiculous. You know, I wrote code a year ago, not 150 years ago, that can't possibly be imbued with some of those ideas. Well, you know, newsflash, technology is increasingly the fabric of our society. It is replacing public space, like the space that statues are in, as the main kind of fabric of our society. And actually prejudice and bias that has its roots in the time of Colston is alive and well in that. We're starting to see, as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, some change in that. So one interesting one I saw recently was how some of the language and terminology in our industry is changing to reflect modern times and more acceptable attitudes. But also there is still a lot to do. Take this example here from Kat Hallam that I saw on Twitter, where she was trying to get her passport renewed, an already quite stressful process, and encountered what was probably a machine learning trained algorithm, which was actually prejudicial against black faces, couldn't recognize black faces as well as it could recognize white faces, which caused her to have to try lots of different photographs and eventually not be able to process her application online. which is, of course, a disadvantage to her just because of that. And that is an unacceptable piece of prejudice that is baked into the work of us as computing professionals. And these are things that not happen by intention, but they happen all the same because these issues are systemic. There's also opportunities for bad actors to use similar technologies. So we saw some researchers in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. They managed to create a machine learning algorithm that could identify whether some people were LGBT or whether they were straight, just from an image that might be publicly available online. And that is obviously hugely problematic that that technology is available off the shelf for oppressive regimes in countries where LGBT people are persecuted, threatened with imprisonment, or even death. There's an interesting framework to help you think about whether some of these things are inadvertently creeping into your work, which was published by the Omidyar Network in 2019. It's called Ethical OS, and they identified 8 risk zones about where unintended negative consequences can creep into our work as digital professionals. So that's really worth checking out if you're interested in preventing unintended harm in your work as part of your practice. Some of you might have seen a diagram like this as well as part of some of the discussions going on about racism and bias on social media in recent weeks. And I think what's interesting about this kind of levels of bias diagram is that the biggest level here, the most kind of insidious, is the systemic bias that can happen all around us and not be intended by any individual, but nonetheless be hugely punitive and hugely prejudicial towards individuals. And I think that word systemic is really interesting to us as computing professionals, because what is it that we do? We make systems. Our work is systemic. We have more power than any system builder could possibly dream of, even a few decades ago, the ability to make systems that work at such scale and such speed that the knock-on effect of unintended prejudice or bias can be scaled up to absolutely enormous levels. And that's why I think we all have a personal responsibility to think about how we can prevent some of these issues in our work, and also how we can exploit, how we can leverage the fact that we do have some control over these systems and we are good, ethical, forward-thinking people to make change. A couple of examples of that that I've seen recently from Apple and from Microsoft here. So the accessibility features built into every Apple device have made a huge difference for people with some specific accessibility needs. And I actually was privileged enough to have a conversation with a woman with locked-in syndrome, which prevents her from speaking or moving, with the help of some of this technology that is built into, in that case, an Apple iPad. Which was incredible that this is just available free for no additional charge as part of the operating systems. And also a little talked about feature of Office 365 here, where Microsoft have used the grammar check feature to scan your work for unintended bias and slurs. And these are 2 good examples of how they're using their privilege to make to help bring about positive systemic change in society. So how do we make change? I've covered a lot of ground there. There's many different ways in which you can do it. I've highlighted on the screen 3 contexts here. I won't read them all out, but just to spotlight a few. You may already be making change through contributing to open source projects or standards like the IEEE Ethical AI standard that's currently in consultation. It could be that you code some clever side projects, volunteer for a charity or a board of trustees, or do all of these things. In work, though, think about the power you have at work, particularly the power to challenge inequalities and bias within the code that you write or the systems you create, and also the ability for you to push for corporate social responsibility. So for the company to do charitable projects or voluntary projects to help people in the community. And lastly, if you want to take this a notch further, I think it would be great if every computing professional worked for a charity or a social enterprise, even if it was just for 1 or 2 years, almost like a social sabbatical, in order to bring their skills into that world and be able to make change with it. So that's something that you could consider as well if you've got a real hunger and a real passion for this sort of stuff like I do. So just quickly, I'll give you 2 examples before I finish. The first is some of the work that I've been doing at Reason Digital that's been particularly busy during the COVID lockdown to help some of the 1.2 million isolated older people who are chronically lonely in the UK. And we did this work with Age UK. This is Barbara Flynn on screen, who you can see. She suffered terribly when her husband and daughter died within months of each other and left her incredibly lonely and isolated at home. So what we did is we helped Age UK create a system which uses the good old-fashioned telephone. Remember, it doesn't have to be a new technical innovation. So we used an API to place calls on the telephone network to connect volunteer befrienders with isolated older people. And the fact that we placed those calls meant we could record them for safeguarding purposes. And it also meant we didn't have to swap the personal details of the volunteer and the vulnerable older person potentially, which helps mean that we can involve more volunteers. This system's called Call in Time, and it processes about 1,000 calls a week at the moment of people all up and down the country forming those friendships and challenging loneliness and isolation. Barbara, through using that service, managed to make a friend for life on it, and her situation is much improved. And interestingly, for those of you that work in computing in a corporate context, we actually worked with Call in Time. We actually worked with Credit Suisse to get some expertise from their tech teams and data scientists in order to help us to automate the safeguarding process somewhat. So we're now able to use machine learning to scan those calls, to identify calls where there might be things that are discussed that seem like there could be a safeguarding risk for that older person. So that might be an older person talking about a door-to-door salesperson scamming them, for example. You might think that's all well and good, Matt. Age UK is a massive organization. You get to do this for a living. I'm one person. What can I do? Well, quick example for you about just the impact that one person can make. This is Greg Owen that you can see here. Greg set up a website a few years ago because he noticed that people in the UK were not being given access on the NHS to PrEP, which is a preventative medication that virtually eliminates your risk of catching HIV. And he wanted to change that. So he bought a website template, which I believe was an old optician's website, and he took all the pictures of glasses off it and turned it into a resource showing you how you could order PrEP and where it was safe to buy it online. A couple of years later, there was a 73% drop in new HIV infections in London, which was attributed to his work. And the national charity, the Terence Higgins Trust, actually adopted that website as a core service that they offer. That's the power of one individual that knows how to make a website. Imagine the skills that you have and what they could do if you put them towards making a change. Thank you.
Matt, thank you so much. That was an absolutely excellent presentation. Lots of food for thought there. Some little phrases that came out that we may pick up later. I like the idea of a fiberglass, the fiberglass Labrador being reiterated in the real world. Social sabbatical, that's a little phrase I'd like to talk about more a bit later. Now, everyone will probably notice all the attendees have got access to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please put questions on there. After we've asked Rebecca to do her presentation for us, we're going to then, the three of us, talk about some of these issues, and we'd love your involvement. We had loads of questions yesterday, couldn't get through them all, but don't let that put you off. Put as many questions on as you can. I'm just going to share my screen now, and then I'm going to hand over to Rebecca because, of course, she is the current BCS President. She is also an expert in, or being a digital leader. Is that okay to say?
Yeah, I think you can say that. Yeah, I'll let you say that.
You can have control of those now, those slides. If not, let me know. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, do you want to move on to the next slide then? That's good. So the reason I asked Brian to do that is because I didn't recognise the first one. And I just thought, I just wanted to double check that he's got the right presentation here, but I recognise that one, so it's all good. I'd like also to thank you very much for having me here today and say, Matt, what a great presentation. And unfortunately for you people in the audience, my slides aren't nearly as good as his, and I apologise for that up front. And also, which is a good thing, I think, my presentation is entirely different from Matt. So we're going to get a range of different ideas to talk about, but there are some threads that I will definitely be picking up because we think very alike on quite a few of the things that Matt talked about. I'd also say I love the picture of the black lab. I have one of my own. She is a failed guide dog for the blind. She would have made a terrible guide dog, but she's a great pet, and I would pet her too, Matt. And reiterate Brian's ask. If you've got questions, put them up there. Matt and I will be really happy to answer them later. Okay, let's have the next slide. So my brief is to talk about digital leadership. And I think you probably will all agree that it is more important than ever right now, as so many people have moved to working remotely or working from home. And an awful lot of people are in leadership roles, whether they're leading a really big team or a really small team, or just one other person. Being a leader really matters, and being a leader remotely and virtually it's even more important to think about how to do it well. I think, and Matt alluded to this, but I think that right now, everybody, all of society has even higher expectations of IT than they had before. And, you know, there's a kind of just an expectation that IT is going to be safe, secure and ethical and always on. Now, it's interesting that Matt called IT, that he said technology is the fabric of our society. I refer to IT as the critical hidden infrastructure. And like all infrastructures, you only really notice the infrastructure when something goes wrong. But like all infrastructures, they are all complex. They're all multifaceted. They've all got lots of connections and they're very complex systems. And in my opinion, all infrastructures need to be created, designed, created, maintained by people who are professionals and think professionally and think ethically and think with integrity. And for me, and I'll tell you why I'm saying this in a few minutes, for me, that's about having externally recognised accreditation and being a member of the IT profession. That's important to me. Just in terms of digital leadership, I've listed some stuff there on the slide, but I think right now there's a really important point about culture and visible leadership. During this time when we're working remotely a lot, leaders have ironically got more opportunities to be visible to their teams than fewer. And I think leaders need to take that opportunity. And I also think that as much as possible, those interactions should be interactive. So they should be a conversation rather than a broadcast, which is why I'm pleased to see the chat number gradually going up, because I do want this to be a conversation too. But I also think right now that leaders need to be extremely conscious of purpose, mental health and well-being, which is a hugely important subject, and even more important right now when we can't physically be near other people and observe how they're getting on. Collaborative and collaboration is perfectly possible virtually. Some things are harder to do virtually, and you miss the face-to-face stuff, and some things we will get back to doing face-to-face when we're able to. But in the meantime, we just need to work a bit harder at that. And as Matt said, inclusive. Our industry doesn't have a great reputation for being as inclusive as it should be, and we all of us need to work hard on that. Okay, Brian, let's have the next slide. I'm just going to do a little bit of a discussion about the British Computer Society, the Chartered Institute for IT. And I'm going to talk to you about being professional, being accredited, and encouraging your organisations and your friends to do so too. So you see our mission there up on this slide. And the next slide, please, Brian, just talks a little bit about some of the stuff that the BCS have been doing in response to COVID-19. And it has been amazing. I have been truly impressed and inspired by the variety and things the BCS have done, but also the speed that they've reacted. And I've put some stuff up here. But you know, the Vital Worker campaign is really important. So many people in the IT profession are key workers and or are vital to making sure that all of our organisations keep running. And that celebrates the role played by IT professionals. I think that's really important because we deserve some celebration, don't we, from time to time. Computers at Schools, CAS, is a very, very well established programme with the BCS, but has highlighted the lack of connectivity and the lack of laptops and the digital divide in the education sector. Also really important, and I think we're going to have more to say on this as we encourage children to keep going with education during summer and back to school in the autumn. You may also be aware that we have an initiative with David Williams, which is about finding educational resources online. We've also done a few papers on healthcare, one on regulation and one on contact tracing, which was published very early on actually in the contact tracing dialogue and has been widely read and I mean, again, it was a very agile, nimble response, so I was pleased to see. We've also pointed out that digital apprenticeships are good because they are very resilient to the current environment and a lot can be moved online, and we have done so. And we're just kicking off a review of standards and accreditation and looking at the review of computer science degrees. So, you know, this is just a small snapshot really of activities that have happened just over the last few weeks, and I've missed out talking about policy with DCMS and the Cabinet Office, but also we have a really important initiative around the digitally left behind, which isn't just about older people, although you know there are older people who are digitally left behind. There are others too. And Matt, it was heartening to see what you said about working with Age UK, because our wonderful London branch have done a great session with Age UK, and I'm really hoping that others will too. And this is just a summary slide. The advert for BCS is nearly over, but I am very passionate about this. I do think that the BCS is a great professional organisation representing the profession, professional members and organisations. And I don't think there's been a more important time ever to have a professional organisation for people in IT careers, because IT is ubiquitous, absolutely everywhere. And we have a responsibility, as Matt laid out very, very clearly, to really think carefully about the work we're doing, make sure that we are designing systems which are good for society, and making sure that we're doing everything that we do to professional standards. This is my last slide, and I just thought I'd spend just a few minutes talking about my own personal experience. So I've been working in technology since 1980. That sounds like a hell of a long time, doesn't it? I started out in cable television and satellite systems and moved into something called teletext that most of you won't remember, but was an early version of getting text on your television screens. And I was fascinated by IT from a very, very early age. And I've basically worked in IT my entire career. Increasingly, an awful lot of what I do is what I would call transformation enabled by IT. I'm not a deep technical person these days. I never was that deep, to be honest. But I spend a lot of time translating. In my career, I spent a lot of time translating and building bridges between deep tech, IT professionals and business users or end users or other stakeholders or senior managers or whoever it is. And I actually think that translation role is important. It's a translation, a communication and an amplification role, because sometimes the best of our IT colleagues aren't also the best at communicating, and we need to get that right. I also think that evolution is important. So what I do today is a million miles away from what I did in 1980, and it's just as well, because there isn't such a career as there would have been in 1980 anymore. So I think all of us have to evolve, and of course technology has changed utterly. And unless we keep current with what's going on, it is difficult, isn't it, to keep interested and keep innovating and keep doing new things. So I had talked a bit about communication, but I think communication is needed for lots of different things, not just for translation, but it's also about building consensus and making sure that we are delivering the systems and the tools that people need and want, and systems and tools that can continue to be useful for many years. There's also issues to resolve. I mean, you know, life is life and business is business, and sometimes people don't see eye to eye, and we've seen a bit of that recently. I do think dialogue is important to resolve issues. I think communication is important, and I think digital leaders have a real responsibility to make sure that that happens. And then I also think that digital leaders need to be both strategic and tactical at the same time. So we all need to be really focused on the big vision, the outcomes, what it is that we're actually driving to achieve. But at the same time, we need to be very mindful about what has to be done today and who's doing it, and are they okay, and are they getting done what they need to be done, and is each step bringing us a step closer to delivering to our outcomes. So that's a bit of a whistle stop through digital leadership, the BCS, and my personal experience, and I'll stop there. And I see we've got a few questions, so I'll open the floor to that. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. We very much enjoyed that. And can I just say, I'm sure I'm not the only one that has ordered a holiday from teletext, even though that was quite some time ago. Before we got onto a chat, I'd just like to launch a little poll. So here's a poll question. It's going to appear to you right now. What's the most important thing a digital leader can give us? A multiple choice. Please get stuck in with that. I'll leave that out for a couple of moments. We did a little bit of research this year, which we did last year as well, just asking individuals in BCS members, what ethical dilemmas they'd faced. This is one of the answers. I'm just going to share this with you. When considering ethical standards at a corporate level, it will be from the point of view of compliance rather than something from an emotional, principled, or idealistic standpoint. It feels like there's a real gap here. So that's a quote from a member. I just wonder, I'd like to get both your views on that particular thought, that actually this tends to be sort of a bit of a transactional thing in a corporation rather than engaging people in a personal level. Perhaps Matt, I could come to you first on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And as you probably picked up from my talk, the reason I engage in what I do is out of passion rather than compliance. So I'm very much empathetic to the idea that there is a place for emotion in this, and there is a place for passion in it, and we should celebrate that and not try and stamp it out. That said, I found it quite useful as well. It's a bit of a double-edged sword that the language of boards, be it boards of trustees or boards of directors, is very much around risk and compliance. And sometimes, if you have a deeply held, passionate belief that perhaps the service that you're being paid to build should be made accessible to people, that highlighting the fact that if it isn't, that could be a breach in compliance with the Disability Discrimination Act, can be a way to be able to try and affect that change and to get the leadership, the higher leadership of an organization to take it seriously. So yeah, I'd say I'm all for more passion, more inspiration, more emotion when it comes to discussing these things. But sometimes you do have to learn to play the game as well, and sometimes compliance arguments can help you with that.
Thanks. Rebecca, obviously you're in a large organization. How do you deal with that, getting people emotionally involved?
So obviously I agree with everything that Matt says, for starters. I think that there's a separation, obviously I would do, between compliance and leadership. And I think that compliance is about making sure you do the right thing, and leadership is about inspiring people to want to do the right thing. So I think good organizations have to have both to make that happen. But I also think, and I've this from my own experience, and we sign a big document in Deloitte every year, which is all about codes of conduct and ethics and standards. And I find that it's really useful to do it on a regular basis, because it actually does make you think about it. It makes you go back and look at the code of conduct. It makes you think about the ethics and read the words and think, oh, actually, yeah, okay, so that's a good reminder. So I think there's something about using a compliance framework to jog people along, to remind them of the way to behave, to just say, just remember, this stuff is really, really important to us. But if that is then not backed up by visible leadership and inspirational leadership, then you won't get the job done.
No. Okay, thank you for that. That's a good introduction to our conversation. We've had a few questions in. Before we share them, I'm just going to show you the poll results. Here they are. What's the most important thing a digital leader can give us? So the top answer was inspiration, which I suppose that's the emotional bit, isn't it? I noticed the second one is working practices that balance commercial and ethical considerations. And there's a thought there, isn't there? Obviously, if you focus completely on one side of the equation, on the ethics and morals, which is not a bad thing, of course, and must be done. But if we just focus there, then people are worried that actually we're never going to make any money. Is that a valid sort of concern, Matt?
I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy, actually, and I think it's only something you need to balance if you're taking a very short-term view of financial performance. I think what you can do well by doing good, because actually in making your services more accessible and removing prejudice from them, ultimately opens up a larger customer base. That shouldn't be the reason that you do it, but that should be, if you do it right, that should be one of the side effects. And fundamentally, for more kind of for other things, let's talk climate change, for example. Great, the quarterly results are going to look good next quarter, but actually if there is no habitable earth in order to spend those profits in, then that's quite a short-term view, isn't it? So I think there is a way to actually bridge that gap rather than see them as two opposing forces.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, let's bring in some of the questions that we've had then. First of all, for you, Matt, is there a list of charities that need tech help somewhere?
Not that I'm aware of, but one of the great things about the charity sector at the moment is almost all charities need tech help. So I would encourage you to there's various websites where you can search for charities. Google is good, and I would punch in. Find some charities that could be in your local community, or they could just be a cause that you have some lived experience in or some passion about. And I would really encourage you to send them an unsolicited email, because actually if you just look at their website about what they're advertising for in terms of volunteers or whatever, it would be very rare that they would turn somebody away that has digital skills offering to help them, in my experience. So I would go in that route. If you're interested in a trustee position, there's a few websites that can help you find them. LinkedIn now has a trustee section of its jobs board, which is quite handy and aggregates a lot on there. I can see there's 1,250 advertised positions right now. There's also Reach Volunteering that has quite a few trustee positions advertised as well. So those are two places you could check out.
Excellent. Rebecca?
Just going to add a comment to that. When I'm thinking about or talking to people about working for charities, I often ask them to think about what I describe as a win-win-win situation. So a win for you, because you're going to learn something new, and it's aligned to one of your passions. I think that's really important. A win for the charity, because they're going to get something that they need and you're going to help them with that, but also a win for your employer. And if you can align those three things, your employer will be very happy doing the charitable work, and so will you, and so will the charity, and so it'll be great.
That sounds good. Now, so I've got a question for you then, Rebecca. This person says that their employer has done some pro bono work for organisations such as the International Alert, Great Ormond Street Hospital, the Red Cross, but the relationships came about through chance meetings. Can BCS act as a matchmaker for connecting IT professionals with charities and social enterprises?
So I saw that question and I thought, I wonder if Brian's going to ask me that question. I don't know is the answer, but it's a great idea. It's just a great idea. I'm going to take it away and see whether there's anything we can do it. I don't know, but I will. But I think it's a great idea. I'll see what I can do.
Okay, well, that's a good one. So you heard it here first. We're going to look into that one. Interesting comment from a lecturer here. It's difficult to get students to engage with the topic of social and ethical responsibility and see the relevance to themselves. Do you know any examples of how this has been done successfully? Matt, any thoughts on that?
I can't think of any examples. that spring to mind. I regularly have tours of young people at Reason Digital that come in, and we do some workshop activities with them. They look at some of our work. What I've found really is opening the conversation with them about what their passions are, what things that they feel, you know, sometimes maybe ask them what they feel angry about in the world or what they think is unfair or unjust. I've really found that almost the younger the individual I'm speaking to, the more likely they are to be passionate about these issues. So I don't know if it's maybe just sort of opening it with their interests rather than talking about ethics or social responsibility, which might be words that are a little bit less accessible to the target group.
Okay, thanks. Just thinking about ICT in schools. A little comment here, which I think you better knock into touch, Rebecca. Why do we not get involved in what's in the ICT subjects offered in schools?
Another great question. And the answer is we have.
Yes.
And it's, I'm trying to think of a polite way of putting it. It's very difficult. So the BCS have been involved in the past with what is taught in schools. And if I remember correctly, I think what is taught in schools is already an update of what was previously offered. And if I remember correctly, and somebody will tell me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, there was a big argument about what's pure computer science and what's IT/digital. Now, I completely get that you have, there is a requirement for pure computer science. I think it's really important as a technical subject to study both at school, further education and university. However, I also happen to think that as digital is ubiquitous and absolutely everywhere, there's a whole range of stuff that isn't strictly speaking about computer science that probably we could and other people could get much more engaged in school. And I think that would probably engage and inspire lots of school children. As a first step, one of the things I have suggested, and I'm hoping that we will pursue, is looking at digital modules of non-computer science degrees and looking at whether we can kite mark them or accredit them or in some way recognize them. Because I think that we do need to understand how to be more inclusive ourselves about the whole subject of IT rather than what is taught on a computer science degree. Did that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's a good. Thank you, Rebecca. Very good. I've got a specific question about Matt's presentation, actually, Matt. So people are clearly listening. You were talking about monitoring calls for older people to ensure their safety. What about the privacy considerations has been asked?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one thing you find if you get quite deep into using technology for social good is that there is this sort of forever sort of trade-off between what you would like to do and the safeguarding considerations that are involved in what you need to do. Because, of course, I talked about not doing harm. It's really important that when we develop that system, that we didn't unintendedly open those older people up for more harm or for the risk of harm. So one of the ways that Age UK do that is to listen to a sample of calls on the network, and it's clear to all participants that those calls are recorded and may be listened to. Obviously, it would be really nice if you know you were able to have a completely private conversation with an older person, but as a volunteer, you know, it's potentially inappropriate to do that because you could abuse your position as a volunteer potentially, or as a volunteer, you might not be trained to identify some of the signs of mental health issues or, you know, or risk factors that a professional is. So we believe it's a good compromise. With the work that we did with Credit Suisse, that's actually allowing us to automate some of that work. So actually that could lead to better privacy. If all the calls are listened to, but they're listened to by a computer applying a risk machine learning algorithm rather than the need to do them all by humans, then that could help kind of square that circle, I suppose. But really good point, really good consideration.
And a good remark here as well. I enjoy teaching I also teach ethics. I don't know whether the writer enjoys it, but they teach ethics to computing students. I agree they don't like engaging with it, but I challenge them to work out what's the worst they could do. That tends to lead them to realizing just how much of an impact they can have. Good idea, Rebecca?
Maybe. I mean, I'm all for opening up students' minds. Oh, apologies for the background there. That's that lab. I do worry slightly about that approach, because I think that there's far too much misuse of computer systems, which is why all our cyber colleagues are so busy. And I suppose I'd rather that they thought about what's the best they could do. However, as an exercise to get people thinking about how potentially dangerous IT can be, I could see that it has merit.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Here's a good question. If you were to land an exciting new position to later, unfortunately, find out that the leadership is emotionally closed, in inverted commas, how would you go about including them in a new direction, or would you consider moving on to a new position altogether? Matt, what do you think about that? Can you affect change from within?
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? I suppose, you know, fundamentally, the first thing you've got to consider is your own kind of safety in that situation. And actually, it can be very demotivating and harmful to your mental health and sometimes your career prospects to be, you know, trying this Sisyphean task of you know, just banging against a closed door over and over again. So, you know, I would caveat it with that. I think good leaders are emotionally articulate, and I think if you're seeing a kind of lack of engagement with emotion and with emotional dialogue, that's not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness in leadership. I would potentially be thinking about, is there a way to kind of build a bridge of communication between you and your leaders there to be able to find a way to communicate in a way that they understand and resonates with them. But personally, I wouldn't be afraid to move on if it seemed that wasn't working. I would expect that it would be their job to build that bridge to me. So in taking that step to try and build a bridge to them, I would already consider I was going above and beyond to try and make change within that organization.
Thanks, Rebecca.
So I agree with you. I think that there are a couple of ways of making change happen from within. And one is, I talked earlier about building consensus and finding stakeholders. Leadership teams find it very difficult to ignore lots of people. They can probably ignore one or two, but they find it difficult to ignore a lot. So if you have an issue and many other people feel strongly about it, you can quite often affect change from within. The other thing is, it depends on where you are in the organisation when you're trying to affect the change. So a fantastic colleague of mine a few years ago had a nervous breakdown and was off work for nearly 18 months. When he came back, he founded our first mental health champion programme, and later went on to be a founder member of the City Mental Health Alliance, which is another organisation where I sit on the board. And we didn't have anything formal around mental health and wellbeing before he did that. And one of the reasons that he was able to do that was because, as a partner in the firm, he stood up and said, I've had this problem, and I think other people have got this problem. If they haven't got it today, they're going to have it in the future. And lots of other people said, I agree, but I've never wanted or felt safe to talk about it before. So I think you can also affect change if you're in the right place in the organisation.
So here's another difficult one. No one's holding back here. This is for you, Rebecca. How many people have the BCS removed from membership purely on ethical grounds? Now, before you answer that, I'm just going to say that we're obviously not going to give numbers on that. But would you like to comment on that question?
Even if we could, I couldn't say what the actual answer to that question is, but it's a great question. And I'm going to go away and find out. What I can absolutely say is that we have had issues with members over the years around our code of conduct.
We have.
And when we know that we have issues with our members over the code of conduct, which covers all aspects of our behaviour and professionalism, we have done investigations, and where we have needed to, we have removed people from membership. Yeah. So I can assure you it does happen, but I can't tell you the numbers.
Yes, and I don't think we probably wouldn't even say a specific number, would we? But the fact is, the code does have teeth, doesn't it? It gives us something to say to people. Well, you know, this has not been adhered to, and it will be acted upon.
And that is, I mean, that is one of the reasons why I feel so strongly that I would like people who are working in the IT industry to be members of our institute, because, as I said earlier, if you've got a code of conduct and you then have calls to look at it every year, you do think about it, and we do require people to uphold it. So if you're not a member today, join, and ask your friends to join.
In fact, someone's just put, it's great to have a code of conduct. It shows you're a professional and rather have good members than a lot of members. Although I think we've got a bit of both there, but they're good, and there's quite a few of them, isn't there? Here's a question I'd like to put to both of you, actually. If you could recommend one thing we could do to help improve inclusiveness in IT, what would it be? Perhaps that's too simplistic, but I think there's an important thing there, isn't there? Where should we focus, perhaps? Matt?
It's a really tricky question, because I think our industry has a problem with inclusiveness. There's no two ways about it, and I think it is the sum of many small things that need to change that makes this problem a big problem. So it's kind of difficult as somebody that has been reflecting on what more I could do, to kind of pick just one thing that we could do. I suppose if it does come down to one thing, I think really expanding our consciousness about it, about trying to better understand the systemic and institutional ways that this problem occurs, so that we are ready and armed to challenge it if we see it in our own professional practice, be that through the work that we do in interactions with our organization, or just in a personal interaction with a colleague. If I had to pick one thing, that would probably be it. But as I said, I think we have a lot of things to do in order to solve that problem. And
I would add that I've spent more than 20 years trying to increase the number of women in the IT profession, and it's about the same as it was 20 years ago, which is slightly disheartening. But I say, well, you know, maybe if I hadn't been manager for 20 years, we'd have even fewer, but, you know, we'd like more. But one of the things I've learned in that journey, and we've tried loads and loads and loads of different things, is although it's very pleasant, women having conversations with other women about the lack of women in IT isn't going to fix the problem, because there are, at best, only 20% of us, which means actually the people that have to change are in the other 80%. So it goes back to what I said earlier about stakeholder engagement and getting consensus. At the end of the day, if we want more Black and ethnic minority and women in IT and in senior roles in IT, and just as an aside, just last week I had an article published in Tester magazine on neurodiversity, and that's another group that we really need to think really carefully about for our profession. If we want that, those people who make the decisions about who to recruit and who to promote and how to reward people, those are the people that we need to get to.
Excellent. Now we're nearly at the end of our hour, folks. That's really flown by, and that's a good sign. It means that that was a fascinating conversation. I'm going to leave you with one more question that's been put here. This is perhaps a reasonably common thought about role models, but it's a nice positive way to end, I think. So this person writes, I'm currently changing career from software developer to computing teacher, but I'm struggling to find a range of diverse role models to include in lessons. Can anyone point me somewhere to help? Matt?
I'm not sure if there's a central resource, but in talking to young people, names that come up for me, Ada Lovelace, Juliana Rotic, who is an IT professional that's done a lot in kind of crisis information. She's an amazing, inspirational IT entrepreneur. Alan Turing also, you know, represents a piece of our kind of diverse history as a profession. So Yeah, I'm sorry I can't think of a list, but maybe if you punch those names into Google, somebody might have written a list that has a few more names on it, including those.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have some friends of the industry. David Williams is one, but I think you can also look sideways to contiguous sectors. I happen to know of an incredible guy called Colin Hegarty, who teaches maths, and he's if you Google Hegarty maths, he's put maths online, maths A level online. He's an amazing inspirational speaker, and he's somebody I think you could look at. And I would also, sparing his blushes, but I would also say our very own Bill Mitchell is somebody to look at and talk to. He works with computers at schools, and he's really, really, really knowledgeable about the sector. And I think he could probably help you too with some great role models.
Okay, that's lovely. And can I just mention the rooms in the BCS headquarters at London are all named after decent role models. So look at the list of our rooms. Matt, you had your hand up.
Yeah, can I just speak out about another question that's coming from somebody that says that they do not care what the social characteristics are of the people that create things. They do a good job. That's their main professional responsibility. I think professional responsibility is important, but actually there's a wider sense of professional responsibility here. You know, if you think back to the example in my presentation about the fact that an algorithm probably designed and coded by white men, because most things are designed and coded by white men in this country, was prejudiced against a black woman. That is the reason that we need this diverse representation, because we just won't, if we don't have representation of the people making things that matches our user base, we'll fail to meet our professional responsibility by default. So I know that that's a kind of common view, so I just wanted to kind of step in and give a counterpoint to that.
Really important.
Lovely. Well, can I say, Matt and Rebecca, we really enjoyed your presentations. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. Can I say thank you to the audience for your participation. Some of you spotted that the poll didn't add up to 100%, which is down to the way I set it up. So there we go. I've learned a valuable lesson today. And finally, just share a last screen with you, just to round off. Really, this is our Vital IT Workers campaign, as mentioned by Rebecca. If you know of anyone that's doing a cracking job in IT right now as a vital worker, please use that hashtag and nominate them. Can I thank you all for your attendance today? Can I encourage you to join us tomorrow when we'll be having a little look at some of the pace of change issues that are being raised. I'd like to thank you on behalf of BCS for attending. I'll bring this meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.